Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We are pleased today to have, I am David Bean, President of the Greater Reading World Affairs Council for this and next program year. I am pleased today to welcome Dr. Robert Hink, who's going to share his findings with us today about his recently co-authored book, The Future of Global Competition, Ontological Security Narratives in Chinese, Iranian, Russian, and Venezuelan Media. Specifically, he's going to discuss the role of identity, narrative, and areas of competition from the perspective of the Chinese and Russian media. Dr. Hink is an associate professor of leadership and director of research at Air War College's Leadership and Innovation Institute. He also serves as deputy director of Air University's Quality Enhancement Plan, where he is responsible for developing and assessing curricula on ethical leadership across the continuum of Air Force learning. He received his doctorate in communication studies from Texas A&M. Throughout his academic career, he has taught over 25 different courses and published over 20 academic articles and book chapters, 30 research reports, and 60 conference papers, in addition to receiving over $500,000 in grant funds from the U.S. Department of Defense and Department of Homeland Security. Prior to coming to Air University, Dr. Hink served as co-department chair at Monmouth College, director of public relations major, and co-coordinator for the Asian Studies minor. Dr. Hink comes to us today in part through an affiliation with fellow board member, Marco Earl. So thank you, Marco, for facilitating this introduction. And with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Hink.
All right, hello all. Thanks for having me. I am excited to be discussing with you a co-authored research project examining the future of global competition as depicted by Russian and Chinese media. Now, before we get started, I have to do a quick disclaimer. The opinions and findings I share with you all today do not reflect any official positions of the U.S. government, DoD, or Air Force. All of these findings and conclusions that I share with you all today come from my own independent research as an academic here. So with that being said, let me get started by noting how last January, my co-authors and I published a book in which we argued that the future of global competition would be characterized less by military conflict and more so by diplomatic, economic, and cultural competition. Unfortunately, we all know what happened a little bit over a month later. Russia began its invasion of Ukraine. Now, while Russia's war in Ukraine may sound like evidence contrary to our thesis, in many ways it actually confirmed our analyses. Specifically, when examining national media discourse from 2014 to 2019, reporting on international influence and global competition, we found that Russian media uniquely defined and reported on its own identity, mission, and purpose as tied to its military largesse, with a view of international affairs as kind of uniquely reflective of a Cold War system, whereby great powers carved out the world into distinct areas of influence around geographic and cultural lines, with Russia locating itself as leader of a distinct Eurasian bloc, albeit one in partnership with China. More importantly, our results suggested that if Russia was unable to effectively draw upon its economic and diplomatic levers of influence to craft this Eurasian economic bloc, it risked doing so through military means. Hence, when Ukraine appeared more likely to join the European Union, it seems that Russia appears to have determined it best in Russia's national interest to coercively cement Ukraine into its area of influence. China, on the other hand, while also portending some level of Cold War-style competition with the U.S., reported more confidence in its ability to actually economically compete within the current international system and affirmed its need for global trade to continue economic growth. Discussion of military sources of influence were infrequent, with far greater focus on economic and diplomatic competition. So while Russia at times was cited as an economic partner in Chinese media and a useful hedge against the West, Chinese media laid little praise on the country and saw itself as capable of shaping the international environment in its own rights. So despite hosting Putin and declaring a litany of areas for strategic partnership prior to Russia's invasion in Ukraine, China's hesitancy to aid Russia in the war due to looming Western sanctions, highlighted the limitations of that partnership that we identified in our analyses, as well as China's greater commitment to global trade more broadly. Why am I sharing this with you all today? Well, to take a step back, I'm going to argue that the stories we tell ourselves, specifically the narratives that routinely circulate within our national news discourse, reflect and to some extent define who we are by providing us with a sense of our past and information about the present, all in which then guides our future actions and beliefs about our imagined futures. Taken together, these stories create the glue that hold our societies together and help give us an understanding of our collective space and place within the international order. And when examined holistically, gives us an idea as to how competition might play out into the future. So to understand the power of this storytelling, I'm going to start by discussing this concept of ontological security that kind of grounds our work here and really helps us understand what drives international behavior here. Then I'm going to offer some very brief historical context of China and Russia's contemporary struggles to secure their sense of self-identity before offering very briefly some of the findings from our book and kind of the potential trajectories we might find ourselves moving forward here. So to get us started, as I stated earlier, our project is about what the future of global competition might look like. To answer this question, we have to start by asking ourselves what motivates state behavior in international politics. Now, realist schools of thought say it's all about relative power, that is, one's ability to protect their physical security in this anarchical world. Liberal institutionalists, however, they've shown that an international society can emerge from this anarchy, bounded together through trade and institutionalized laws, allowing for common prosperity to emerge. Constructivists add that anarchy is simply what states make of it, and they focus kind of more on the normative power of ideas and language as constituting how we come to understand our relationships with our environment and others. Now, all three of these perspectives offer some insight into the nature of global politics. They all have their limitations as well. And so to some extent, you have to approach these things from all of these lenses here. For our project, we focus on this concept of ontological security, which leans a little bit more towards the constructivist side, but also recognizes the importance of these routinized institutional relationships and concerns about anarchy and, making meaning in the world. So more specifically, according to this theoretical framework of ontological security, we argue that rather than concerning themselves with physical security, we believe that states' primary goal is securing a sense of self, a sense of who they are within the world. Why? Well, ontological security, that is understanding who you are, is a prerequisite for agency. For instance, you need to understand who you are in order to develop and identify your interests so that you know how to act towards those interests. Without a collective sense of identity, a nation is unable to locate what they want to do, what is valuable to them. And without that sense of interest or purpose, it's hard to go about actually actualizing those interests in a competitive environment. So you see, first you need a secured sense of who you are in order to develop the idea as to where you're going to go and be able to actually act towards it. The underlying assumption behind all this is that human beings are constantly searching for meaning in our lives. Each day we wake up and ask ourselves, what's the purpose of life? Who are we? How should we be spending our time? These questions provoke anxiety that, if unmanaged, leads to depression and paralysis. In other words, again, without a sense of purpose, we might sit at home and do nothing, believing our existence is meaningless. To combat this, then, we have to create meaning. We create meaning through stories about who we are, how the world works. These stories about ourselves end up defining our character, which tells us what we're supposed to be achieving, allowing us to move towards that goal. And then those stories about the environment and our routine relationships with others create a sense of stability and predictability to which then we can plan and actually prepare how to reach those goals. So ontological security says that this process plays out similarly on the individual level, as well as the organizational and state level. For a political community or society to exist, its members must perceive themselves to be a part of it, and they must share a common understanding of the rules and expectations of other people's behavior. And so societies too propagate stories to its people, explain to them their collective origins and identity, the nature of their international environment, and relationships to others. So if we were to go a step deeper, one could argue that a nation state is really nothing but stories about themselves. For instance, if I were to ask you, what is the United States? Is it geography? Is it common sets of laws or institutions or values? I would argue that all of those answers don't fully suffice. They don't fully paint the picture if we look historically. So for instance, think about geography. Geography is in flux. From our very beginning, we told stories about how we understood our geography through things like manifest destiny. Over time, we include new states or new territories in our borders. We had colonies that, were created and then disappeared, but we still have some relationship with those. And so to what extent is geography really defining this? If you're an American, but you don't live in America, or you were born on an off-sea base or spent most of your time in another country, are you still American? If so, then what's your relationship with geography? It gets a little fuzzy. Likewise, if we think about institutions or laws, perhaps the best example is kind of like a counterexample, or what happens when these institutions or laws exist, but the way that we approach them or the way that we understand them starts to unravel. So for instance, think back on the US Civil War. The North and the South had the same constitution. We had the same kind of historical upbringing, but what that meant to each of these groups was different. And as conflict over slavery emerged, the way that we started interpreting these institutions or values became different. We started citing different origin stories. We started defining ourselves as, Yankees or Dixie. And so that sense of being really unraveled, that story of a common identity disappeared, and we ended up emerging in conflict. Likewise, if we were to think about America's foreign policy more contemporarily, from an ontological security standpoint, we might ask, are our foreign actions reflective of our self-identity? In this sense, the answer would be yes. What I mean by that is our sense of who we are, our stories about what's motivating our actions provide sense-making for us to engage in these foreign conflicts. For instance, are we the shining beacon on the hill, emphasizing democracy and human rights? Or are we the world policeman? Or even contrastedly, are we MAGA? These are three different imaginings, three different stories that tie back into our past that then define who we are, which then implicates what we think our goals are, which then ultimately motivates our actions in the world environment here. So the nation then is thus ultimately grounded in the stories we tell about ourselves, our routine relations with each other and others, all informed by our perceptions of the environment, which in turn influences our foreign policy behavior as well. So too then is the international order a social construct. Despite conflict continuing today, we tell ourselves that we have moved from the past, the idea of a short, nasty, brutish international scene that Hobbes painted so long ago, and we now claim to exist in a rules-based order symbolized by the UN Charter and principles of human rights, self-determination, free trade, sovereignty, etc. And while I would agree that our international environment is qualitatively different from the times that Hobbes wrote in, note that Russia now on multiple occasions has violated the sovereignty of another state. And how has the world reacted? By only providing Ukraine with indirect support to protect its sovereignty here. So this idea of the international order is imagined, it needs to be enacted, it needs to be constantly reinforced, it's subject to change. And likewise, our identities are also constantly in flux as that environment, experiences, and relationships constantly change around us. So reflecting on our own ontological security, we can see how individuals are motivated by a sense of identity. Before kind of moving in and thinking about what China and Russia's ontological security might look like, it might be important to hold up the mirror and look at ourselves. So for instance, we can see the power of ontological security from the last 5-6 years of our own politics. Regardless of which political party you affiliate yourself with, we can see that President Trump's 2016 campaign demonstrated the strength, the allure of ontological security, through which his campaign and his rhetoric was able to successfully identify the anxiety Americans were feeling over our changing international environment, our need for identity and purpose in our lives, by invoking notions that we had lost control over our borders as migrants are supposedly taking our jobs, by playing on our concerns over the loss of American manufacturing and the sense of American pride, by claiming that America didn't win anymore, scapegoating China as the reason for all of this. In this sense, President Trump in 2016 was able to successfully draw heavily on American nostalgia and stories, an imagined past, an imagined time when America was strong, society was stable, and that provided a sense of security and stability in terms of how we're kind of focusing on who we are and what our interests were. So as that example shows, and as ontological security kind of assumes and explains, actors are hesitant to change. We can be attached to our previous ways of being and doing. And so likewise, the United States was attached to some of its previous notions of strength, which then one confronted with fears of American decline, resulted in us kind of double downing or wanting to go back with that sense of nostalgia. More specifically, during times of instability, then, we see that this is when actors are most likely to fall back on their past routines and identities to find a reimagined sense of stability and security. In contrast, though, when one is ontologically secure, we're more able to adjust our actions and identities to our environments. But when we're ontologically insecure, that's when we perhaps detrimentally fall back on those past identities and become unresponsive to the new challenges in our environments, unable to adapt and change. Most importantly, when crises hit, this is when our imaginations are most open, though, to new conceptualizations of ourselves and others. So, if we want to understand the future of global competition, we have to first turn to and understand how it's discussed and narrated within countries' domestic politics. Specifically, we have to understand how states struggle with securing the sense of self-identity, after which then we can start to understand how those stories, tying that past to the present, start to create this projected future, which then provides the motivating agency upon which they can compete and starts to define the goals in which they find meaning working towards, which then helps us develop some expectations about what's going to happen. So when looking at China and Russia, we can see that this approach is particularly useful in that both countries have struggled recently with the loss of identity, which had led to paralysis and societal unraveling in the past. Only recently have these countries started to find new ways to reinvest in new imagination of who they might be and what their interests might look like into the future. To start with Russia, we can see that the struggle over identity, kind of the landscape that set the seeds for what we read about and see today, occurred really at the fall of the Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union marked one of these crisis points, a particularly ontologically insecure moment for Russia, whereby its beliefs in its military, its scientific and cultural superiority, all had came crashing to an end. Its routine relations within its own society were broken as Russians started having to experiment with market economics because the collapse of the Soviet economy and its communist style economic system was no longer viable. With the end of the Cold War, it offered a new opportunity for Russia to start to redefine its identity. Russian media and Russian politicians and society started to ask themselves, who is Russia? Is Russia a European country? Or is Russia actually a distinct Eurasian nation separate from European Western values? Is it a great power like its past? Or is it simply just another country in the global community? Unfortunately, the anxiety over all of these struggles happening from the collapse of the Soviet Union overwhelmed Russians. And this is what enabled Putin's rise in the late 1990s and early 2000s, whereby he started to craft a new narrative identity, defining Russia in conflict with the West. Here, Putin was astute in recognizing and playing up on these anxieties. He started to reattach and stoke Russians' previous imagined pride by essentializing Russian identity and refracting anxieties towards others. In other words, according to Putin, all the events that were happening, the trauma that Russians were experiencing wasn't Russia's fault, but it was the West. It was the West that didn't welcome Russia. It was the West that treated Russians inequitably. And it's the West that's continuing the Cold War imperialism, just like it had in the Soviet era, pursuing its own self-interests and not those of the broader community of nations. And so Russia then became defined as different from the West. In addition to this, Russia under Putin started imagining kind of what a new global order might look like. This idea of a Novorossiya, Russia being the defender of a new world order, which buckled down on this idea of Russian homeland, this idea of Russian traditional values, things like the Orthodox Church. And all of these then again further started to create this wedge between what Russia stood for and what the West stood for. Somewhat similarly, but still unique, China too faced an identity crisis. China, again, like Russia, is a country that prides itself with significant prestige, going back historically longer than Russia, particularly by talking about how China as a culture, a political entity, has had millennia of continuous existence. And throughout that millennia, they had historically been technologically and superior and economically superior to much of the world up into the 1800s. However, in the 1800s, this is when China's sense of self started becoming ontologically insecure. China found itself overtaken by Western trade, new scientific technologies, and opium, beginning what marked what China calls its century of humiliation at the hands of these Western nations. These events weakened the Chinese state, stoked domestic upheaval and Chinese nationalism, but China then faced its most ontologically destabilizing moment when it lost its war to Japan in 1895, a country it had considered subordinate, its little brother. And so China's identity was tied to its superiority, top of the hierarchy in the Asia Pacific. Losing then a war to someone that you saw as inferior to you was the final, straw that broke the camel's back. And so 10 years later, China's last imperial dynasty fell. And it wasn't until 1945 that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, declared that China had finally stood up, capable of defending itself, emphasizing China's revolutionary communist identity throughout the next 3 decades. However, in doing so, more instability came. We see multiple kind of narratives ebb and flow until today. In this case, China found that its revolutionary identity finally plunged the country into chaos during the Cultural Revolution. This crisis then enabled a new identity to be forged, one led by Deng Xiaoping, who believed that China needed to develop economically. Fast forward today, while China has experienced tremendous economic growth, it also faces new challenges, like that of escaping the middle income trap, a concept coined by economists that notes the difficulties of moving from the state of a developing nation to a fully developed country. These challenges all threaten to unravel the CCP's claim to legitimacy, namely economic growth and completing the unification of China with Taiwan, creating this China dream or the revitalization of Chinese strength here. And so under Xi Jinping, the party has doubled down on its ontological supplying endeavors with greater media regulation and censorship, much like Putin's Russia, in order to kind of tighten the grip around Chinese society and offer Xi Jinping as kind of a symbol of a paternal, benevolent leader who's able to continue ushering China through further success and reform. So that's the theoretical background. That's some of the context of how these identities have been in flux. I apologize if you hear the barking in the background. My 2 dogs are fighting. Hopefully that's not too distracting here. What I want to spend the last 10 to 20 minutes here talking with you all about is what are the country's then future goals? If we take this idea of ontological security, we recognize the struggles that China and Russia face. How do we look at how they're talking about themselves and their interests right now? And how does that help us understand what the future is going to look like here? To note, at any given time, there's always multiple stories of the past that circulate within a society's cultural memory. These stories are reframed and repurposed. They're selectively highlighted and ignored, discarded, and brought back up to support the needs of the present moment. And so, although we see that there's lots of possible alternatives, when these stories start to become repeatedly offered and consumed to a domestic populace, to a society, they start to form somewhat lasting identities, that is, common expectations of what the country is supposed to be, what they look like, and what they're moving towards. This then creates some stability and predictability in terms of what these trajectories over time might look like. Although always remember that crises are capable of reopening this collective imagination, so shifts are always possible. So to share what these future trajectories look like, I will briefly give you some of the big highlights of the presentation of the book that my colleagues and I recently published here. What we did is we looked at Chinese and Russian news media from 2014 to 2019. So that was the time period. That's the data, and it's always important to recognize, what the data is, so that you can understand what the limitations and constraints are. So we're just looking at news media in these two countries from that 2014-2019 period. What was it that we found? Well, we found that if you look at the big picture, the Russian worldview, you see the word network graph here that highlights the most common terms within our data set here. When you look on the left, you see some of those themes that kind of popped up. The big picture summary is, according to the Russian worldview here, we see that the global order, we see a picture of the global order as unfair and unraveling. The global order, according to these Russian narratives, ends up being defined by great power conflict. And from this, then, there's going to be two camps that are going to emerge. The two camps are the West versus the East. And then within this larger narrative of what the international system looks like, this great power, Cold War type of competition over power blocks, is a return or the need for Russian strength and power. Now, you might think like, oh, of course, this is kind of the common realist paradigm in international relations. Well, when I share in a little bit what the Chinese worldview looks like, you'll see that it's not the same as the Russian worldview here. So it's important to recognize and really try and understand what are the implications. Why is it that Russian media is talking about these stories? How does this impact its identity and its future actions here? When we look specifically then at how Russian media creates these narratives of this international environment, specifically how it talks about what the substance of the global order looks like, we see the following themes here. So, according to Russian media, the current order is in decline. Specifically, the US is in decline, the West is in decline. And this decline then is opening up a new multi-order, multipolar order that enables other countries to kind of fend or create space for their own interests here. Within this narrative of decline, we see these pittings of the West versus Russia, this essentialized identity whereby Russia is both seen oftentimes as the problem, but also at times the world needing Russia in order to make any meaningful change. Interestingly, we see Russian media actually gleefully looks at criticisms from the West, noting about how Russia isn't enacting the current international order and values here. Why? Well, the fact that the West is criticizing the US feeds into this broader idea that the West needs Russia. That is, the West can't get anything done without Russia's help. And so then this provides a sense of self-importance. This grants Russia a sense of agency, that the world needs them in order to get things done. That means that the Russian people, they can transfer that sense of agency, and then they feel like the world needs themselves in order to get something done. All while they're doing this, they're also critiquing and admonishing the US, focusing that the US, the narratives that the US tells about the global order are not true. The US is really a unilateral actor. They're a self-interested actor. And the US at times are actually the ones that are the revisionists trying to recreate the international order here. From this then, you get a very clear picture that the great power competition a true return to this realist anarchical world is what motivates the Russian imaginary about what's happening in the world here. And so the result is, according to the Russian media, the world is going to be in this big block between the West versus the East. Russia is going to partner with China as the East in order to fend off the West. And so then Russia needs to take steps and actions to bolster its power vis-a-vis the West here, which is a very, dangerous and sad picture to play here. It's not a very cooperative one here. And you can imagine how this would feed into some of the actions in Ukraine. Lastly, what's Russia's specific role then in the global order? Well, as I kind of hinted at here, the big takeaway is that Russia's sense of self, Russia's sense of ego is inflated. That is, Russia sees itself as an agentic actor. It needs to exercise agency in the world. The world needs it. Other countries need it. The world, according to Russian media, needs a strong Russia in order to balance against the US and West, because it's the US and West that's hypocritical, self-interested, immoral, and decadent. Russia, on the other hand, is speaking to those countries who don't like postmodern values, portraying itself as representing traditional notions of conservative values through the Orthodox Church, traditional notions of what it means to be, male and female, traditional notions that's anti-LGBTQ plus. And so that's where Russia is seen as kind of trying to protect the world against this Western empire that's trying to take over through these cultural encroachments here. It builds upon the sense of agency by focusing on its military and historical prestige and strength. And then it uses specific examples like in Syria, as well as partnerships with China here to emphasize how China is capable and has done so in the past, become a very powerful and important actor around the world. Again, it's a dangerous sense of agency that has to be enacted against the West, in opposition to the West, and typically utilized through military means here. So then, what are the big picture future trajectories and pathways of Russia? It's a metaphor of Russia being a besieged fortress. It's a fortress whereby Russian values and culture, where Russian society is being surrounded by the West, but Russia is strong. Russia is a fortress that's able to exert influence back against the West here. And so then what we predict or what we expect to see from happening, something that might occur because of this narrative trajectories, because of these stories and this idea of Russian identity, is further decoupling between Russia and the West, with Russia focusing on cementing its Eurasian sphere of influence. As we can see with Russia's war in Ukraine, this is exactly what's been happening, especially when Russia and Europe start to sever its energy ties, which will then further separate the need between the two countries for cooperative action, pushing Russia closer to China. Again, it's tied to military prestige. The idea of Russia being a strong country that's able to invade its neighbors and protect this group of regional influence and culture that the Russians believe is important. And if Russia is unable to secure its Eurasian economic zone peacefully through culture, economic, and diplomacy elements, then this is when it's most likely to exert its influence to forcibly bring people back into its sphere. Again, this is what you started to see with Ukraine here, likely going to happen into the future unless some major crisis hits, which I'll talk about at the very, very end. Okay, so that's the Russian worldview. Real quick, what's the Chinese worldview? So like I said, the Chinese worldview imagines the international environment somewhat similarly, but also strikingly different from Russia. You can see, again, some of the common words that are talked about in Chinese news here, as well as some of the phrases that are shown in the left. But the summary is that, yes, China, like Russia, sees the global order under threat. And yes, like Russia, China is seen as needing to step up and take a leadership role in the international environment. However, unlike Russia, that Chinese leadership is there to ensure a multilateral global trade environment from which all can benefit. That is different. That represents less of a realist approach to international relations and a little bit more of an institutionalist approach, although not a liberal one, not with liberal values per se. What are some of the stories that kind of breathe life into this overarching worldview? Well, if we look at how Chinese media discusses the substance of the global order, they focus on two main institutions. They say that really the international environment is two things and two things only: the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. Both of these things are the institutions that hold together how our routine relations with each other are able to be enacted here. China then, according to this, upholds and is actually defending the international system because China habitually and routinely supports and participates in the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. They've done so by contributing to United Nations peacekeeping operations, by helping other people gain greater voice in the United Nations, but also by enforcing and always following World Trade Organization laws and regulations, at least according to the Chinese point of view here. And so Chinese identity then gets tied as a regular contributor and faithful partner to the international order. They say that this has always been done going back to the early 1990s to the present as well. Where then do the threats to the global order come from, and what's China's role here? So the Chinese, according to this narrative logic, say that the big problem is the US doesn't support this global order. It's the US that is increasing nationalism and becoming more isolationist. So think about the MAGA policies, think about the US pulling out of international treaties, no longer supporting the World Health Organization, as well as the Paris Climate Accords. In addition, though, it's also that the US doesn't support this multilateral win-win type of global order that the UN and World Trade Organization supposedly ascribes, but instead it's the US who's always taking these unilateral activities, that's always having this Cold War mentality, that's always trying to contain and hold China down here. And so the US is violating these norms of what appropriate behavior is supposed to be looking like. The solution is that China needs to step up. China needs to emerge as the new global leader here. China needs to make sure that they support globalization and multilateralism, viewing them as these historical inevitable forces here. And if the US is going to remove itself, or if the US is causing problems, then it's the Chinese leadership that needs to step up and actually safeguard those developing nations or safeguard others and reinforce these patterns, laws, and routine interactions to make sure that everybody is able to trade and get prosperous. What then is the future trajectory of the Chinese narrative here? Well, ultimately, China, at least in the short or medium term here, is going to try and uphold the current global order. At least this is what our data from 2014 to 2019 suggested. They're going to become a major leader in trying to promote the economic development and upholding this multilateralism. Why? Well, all of this best enables China to achieve its Chinese dream and its national rejuvenation. That is, China needs free trade. It needs multilateralism in order to create the space by which it can continue to bide its time and garner enough power so that it can economically develop. If trade doesn't exist, if we get isolationism or containment, then that actually threatens Chinese security because they're not able to take advantage of international technology and have Chinese companies go out and become more innovative by forcing them to compete with international companies as well. However, the big caveat here is, although it looks positive in the short term or maybe medium term here, once China becomes powerful, once China actually does rejuvenate its strength, then the question is what will China's view of the international environment look like at that point? Our data doesn't say anything that China inherently believes the current international order because of its values. China believes and supports it because it represents and supports Chinese interests here and now. And so once China's interests here and now are utilized, that is realized because it's achieved its dream of regaining its strength, then at that point, China might take more aggressive steps in shaping the international environment more in its image versus maintaining the US's image here. So if you're to boil it down, China's optimistic now for its rejuvenated strength, or at least it was from 2014 to 2019. Why do I keep saying 2014 to 2019? Well, I'm going to conclude by noting that crises change perceptions. Crises can change these narrative trajectories and create those moments for reimagining our identity and our interests, both ourselves, but also others and our world around it. And so I think it's important to recognize some of the events that have happened post-2019 when we did this analysis. Events that were happening over the last few years shows a bunch of troubling elements, both when we think about Chinese and Russian narratives about the world and what the future of competition might look like. Some of these things in China included a Chinese stock market collapse, the US blocking Huawei. You can see other examples in terms of now the US is blocking China's ability to gain new high advanced chips for computing. As well as other problems that China's had with economic modernization, in part stemming from COVID-19 lockdowns, but also just a slowing to more stagnant economy more broadly. Throw in a US-China trade war, difficulties with Hong Kong protests, and now concerns over Taiwan. And we see that all these events are starting to potentially unravel, perhaps, the faith that China might have that the current international system is actually able to contribute to its own economic interests and development goals. In other words, we're already seeing some decoupling between the United States and some of its Western allies and China. This decoupling means that that international environment doesn't exist. And if that international environment doesn't exist, then China doesn't have an interest in supporting it because it no longer is able to provide China with the trade and the goods that it needs to. Likewise, when we turn to Russia, the big thing is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. To what extent does this collapse or speed up the collapsing of the Russian myth? In this circumstance, the idea that Russian identity was based upon a strong macho military strength, that is no longer there. To what extent has the curtain been pulled back so that Russians are no longer able to believe in those narratives? A story, we can create those stories, but no story can last being divorced completely from the material realities that we live and interact in. So in this sense, the big scary thing for Russia is it's facing another ontological insecure moment where its identities, its belief in itself is starting to fracture, and that might cause them to lash out, to try and rationalize what's happening. The trauma that they're going through is going to create some extra truculent developments in the future here. What does China look like in the future then? Well, like I said, the extent to which it's going to uphold the international environment might now be in doubt because of the decoupling that we're starting to see between China and the West. With this, in combination with slowing economic growth, the whole story of the Chinese Communist Party's ability to deliver and make good on the China dream might also be in doubt. If these peaceful economic elements are now potentially not there, the likelihood that the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping's leadership turns to other means to assuage Chinese people's sense of identity through more nationalistic elements, or perhaps, military success by reunifying with Taiwan, all of those also increase as well, which also pose a more scary picture today than when we first examined our data set back in 2019 here. So this doesn't mean that these are the trajectories that have to happen. All this means is that we need to recognize and continue to try and understand what's driving other countries' interests, where are they coming from, how are they interacting with the world, and really trying to gain that understanding and useful empathy so that we can hopefully create some better policy and avoid misperceptions, safeguard against conflict towards others, so that we can kind of develop that more informed policymaking to make sure the world is a better place. So with that, I've talked for a while. I appreciate everyone tuning in and listening. I will go ahead and turn it over to David here to kind of wrap things up and open things up for any type of discussion.
So thank you very much, Doctor. Great presentation. Questions are starting to come in through the chat. So please, one and all, if you have questions, get them in and we will follow up with the doctor shortly. I did want to allow you, Robert, to take a brief breather here while I make some announcements about upcoming programs. So our next presentation is on Thursday, not our traditional Wednesday, but Thursday, March the 9th at Legends. This is for International Women's Day. Our presenter this year will be Yohani Cepeda-Freitas, newly elected representative to the General Assembly in Harrisburg from the city of Reading. Then also in March, on Wednesday the 29th, and this will be a virtual presentation, our subject will be Costa Rica, and our presenter will be Elizabeth Smith, who is the Public Diplomacy Officer at the U.S. Embassy in Costa Rica. That will be a virtual program at 12 o'clock. In April at Legends, Wednesday the 12th at noon, we have Dr. Spencer Stober from Alvernia, who's no stranger to us, having presented before. He's going to present this time around also on climate change. That was his last presentation to us, and he'll be doing an update for us. And on Wednesday, May the 17th at noon, Legends, also a repeat for us, Ambassador Charles Ray will be talking to us about race, American diplomacy, and why diversity is important. So we appreciate all of our members participating with us in these presentations and invite you to make sure you register for those upcoming presentations as well. So with that, we can jump into some questions. Some questions are starting to come in. I wanted to open things up, Doctor, by asking, you've given us a really good, talking about the Russian worldview in terms of its sense of identity and predicting behavior in Ukraine. I was wondering, in light of the announcement that Sweden and Finland intend to join NATO, and with respect to the Baltic states as well, just curious how that Russian historic narrative might be used to interpret possible future events in those two areas that border Russia.
Yeah, great question. I think the most direct response is it's going to feed into a heightened sense of being surrounded. And so to a large extent, those announcements then reinforce this narrative of Russia as a besieged fortress with the wolves at the gates trying to knock things down. And the reason why that narrative is important is because then that enables Putin or the Russian government to re-emphasize to its people that they need to circle the wagons, that they need to come together and be less open to other people's ideas. As I said in the talk, the goal, you want to be ontologically secure, because if you're secure in the sense of who you are, then you can actually adapt your identities and interests and routines to your environment, because the environment changes. If you're ontologically insecure, then you get stuck in your scripts and who you are. You become defensive. That means that you are less able to adapt to what's happening. I'm sure any of us who've gotten in a heated argument with someone and sees that other person getting defensive or ourselves getting defensive, realize that we just hunker down and we aren't easily persuaded, right? So there's less common understanding happening there. So moves of NATO enlargement, it's going to further limit the ability for Russia to kind of adapt and be more cooperative. That being said, the asterisk there with it is I don't think there's going to be conflict in that arena on those borders so much. Putin is, as the narratives kind of reflect of how he's kind of described what Russia is and what the world looks like. Putin himself is also a realist, and I think he can easily recognize that his material resources are already constrained, and it's unlikely that he would want to try and overextend himself even farther beyond the Ukraine conflict here. So in terms of the short term, the focus is going to be purely on Ukraine and trying to survive that and making sure that Russia doesn't get overly embarrassed with domestic support ultimately waning from that Ukrainian conflict there.
Okay. So we have two questions from Professor Randy Newnham, professor at Penn State University. I'll start with his first question, and that is, how can we in the United States and the West impact these Chinese-Russian narratives? Do our actions really matter when they can distort the facts any way they want?
Great question. And the answer is, to some extent, our actions do matter. I know that's kind of the cop-out answer, but to give you an example of this, stories can't just be unidirectional. If you really want your story to come to define the reality, it needs to be a story that resonates with the experiences, the lived experiences of those that you're targeting, your audience here. They also have to be believable. That is, they have to resonate with all the other stories about, your past histories, other events you're seeing around the world. And so the best example of how change is possible, and the limits of a pure propaganda approach here, is when you look at China's initial response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If you recall, the Chinese official narrative was nearly the exact same as Russia's, but within a couple weeks and then a month or two later, that Chinese official narrative started to switch. It started to soften, and it started to actually kind of criticize what Russia's doing. And so why was that happening? Well, that was happening because as global media started reporting on the brutalities and the brutalities of committed against Ukrainians and the losses that the Russian army was facing, all of a sudden the stories of Russia being a strong, faithful partner, or the stories of Russia being forced into this war, started not to resonate so much with the Chinese domestic populace. And so while the Chinese might still believe to some extent that the US might be trying to contain it, the idea of Russia as an ally is harder to digest, because now your ally is doing something atrocious, because you can see the deaths that's being caused. Also, your ally doesn't seem very capable. So if you, a Chinese person, look at Russia's behavior, do you want to be stuck with an ally who's not very capable? Do you want to be stuck with an ally who's doing things that don't make you feel good? Because that also then partly reflects on you. So because of that, the Chinese Communist Party, the official government narrative, had to start backtracking what was happening, because the reality didn't fit what was happening, and they still have to be responsive to the Chinese domestic populace there. So that shows you that narratives can shift and change. In terms of how can we impact these narratives, if you would have asked me this 5 years ago, I would have said, yes, there's definitely ways that we can kind of bump the Russian narrative trajectory and the Chinese narrative trajectory. At this point, though, now I'm far more pessimistic. I think both countries are seeing themselves under considerable strain that wasn't there 5 years ago. And because of that strain, what seems to be happening is they've fallen back on retrenched identities. I've already explained, we can already see that with Russia. In China, Xi Jinping over the last couple of years, specifically with COVID-19 and the new Politburo Standing Committee and everything, shows that he is less open to the ideas of Western norms, democracy. He's more open to the ideas of just circling the wagons, the need to centralize power in order to grapple with the challenges that China is going to face. And so that focusing inward is dangerous, because you're not going to be as open to other ideas. You might fall to hubris to some extent there. You might form some echo chambers, but at the end of the day, it's focusing inward, regaining collective power there, and that's less likely to be bumped and moved there. So the last thing I would say is, at this point, the biggest thing that the US can do is kind of twofold. One, and it's a very artful thing, so it's not a clear-cut answer. It's a very gray area here. The first is, don't try and obviously play into some of these narratives. So the US has tried to not support weapons that might actually cause Ukrainians to invade into Russian territory. That would escalate things, that would antagonize a Russian sense of anxiety over what's happening. So don't fall into those traps there. Likewise, when we're thinking about US-China relations, don't overly emphasize the democracy versus autocracy thing, because then that's going to essentialize the identities more, which then means there's less common ground there. So that's one kind of trap there. Don't play into the idea that you are going to attack China or overly ensure Taiwan's security, because then that might be interpreted as a more aggressive stance, which then might create a regressive stance in response there. So that's one thing. Don't fall into the traps. Don't exasperate things. The second strategy is kind of something that's completely different. It goes the opposite direction, and that is you exasperate the tensions in order to try and generate or create an environment whereby the material realities of the world are now devoid or separate from the actual narratives that the Chinese Communist Party or the Russian government are telling. So you look at Russia in Ukraine in this extent, what I would argue is at some point, the Russian people are going to have to recognize that their narratives of strength and pride are not true. How they respond to it, I don't know. There's potential for conflict there, but they'll have to recognize that it's not true because it just doesn't reflect reality enough. So too for China, you could try and amp up the competition, and then you try and convince the Chinese people that if you look at the US ways of doing things, that seems to be economically successful. If you look at the alternative path that the Chinese government's moving you down, you can see that it's being less useful. That then starts to prompt a reassessment of the narratives. So that was a long answer, but hopefully that kind of addresses some of the complexities there.
So Randy's follow-up question was, how can China and Russia work together well when they have such different goals in their narratives?
Yes, that is a great question. And that's a question that I think that the US should take some glee and happiness with when we look at this picture. So very astute to figure out that there's different narratives here. More dangerously, if you look historically and geographically, the potential for conflict between China and Russia is more significant than conflict between China and the United States. Why? Well, they actually share a giant long border. Moreover, they have different cultural ideas. And historically, they had significant competition back in the Mao Zedong, end of Stalin type of days there. So much so that for those of you who are good historians, you'll know that Khrushchev actually asked Nixon back in the day what the US's response would be if the Soviet Union launched a nuclear weapon against Mao Zedong, who was supposed to be China, the Soviet Union's ally there. So lots of potential for conflict. That same area for conflict is going to continue to fester today. Russia is turning more towards China. No longer is Russia able to send all of its energy products to the European Union, who's cutting all those ties and not reinvesting in those. And so China is going to be the primary consumer. This creates some interdependency. China needs energy, and so Russia is providing that. But Russia's economy is pretty narrowly dependent only on that one sector, which then gives China a little bit more negotiating and bargaining space there. Furthermore, China's economy is actually growing in other areas. So over time, the Chinese economy and influence is going to be substantially larger, which is going to force Russia into more of a junior partner, which is going to cause some conflict with the Russian identity of itself being strong and good. Now, to some extent, the Russians can assuage or kind of rationalize that by saying like, hey, we're part of Team East, Team Anti-West. And so in that case, they can identify themselves with China in order to support their prestige and strength there. But over time, as more Chinese influence comes into Russia's cultural sphere, then Russia's going to have the same problem it has with its West, with the West. How does it maintain its unique cultural identity when all of these Chinese business people or migrants are coming in and starting to cause some difficulties there? So the answer is short term, they can cooperate when they have a common identity and they both believe that their interests are best served fighting that common identity. That is a very weak basis for an alliance. There's not a lot of other dimensions to it, which means that that's a fragile strategic partnership. They're not friends, they're strategic partners there. Over.
Okay, so I'm going to ask two more questions in the interest of time. It's 1 o'clock, so we need to start thinking about winding things down. The first question is a substantive one. The second one's more for fun. The first question comes from your colleague, Marco Earl, and it's a mouthful. So I'm going to read this one. His question is, evident by the Ukraine situation and to some degree China's handling of COVID-19, some geopolitical crises open rhetorical arenas to significantly redefine and re-legitimize identity. Who do you see as the key communicative players to legitimize new political futures for Russia and China, considering that in a multipolar world, media systems are becoming more and more fragmented?
Great question. As always, Marco, very insightful. I will try to briefly and most accurately get to the heart of the question. I'm going to focus a little bit more on China here than Russia for the sake of time. So most astutely, recognizing the COVID-19 crisis, there was an interesting moment for a change within the Chinese Communist Party and their visions of what their future trajectory was going to look like. Unfortunately, the crisis did not create a reimagining what was happening. So for those of you who were not following CCP internal dynamics here, Li Keqiang was number 2 prior to the most recent rehashing of the Chinese elite here and everything. Li Keqiang was focused and seen more as an economic modernizer, so he's more interested into the Western economic principles rather than this idea of China uniquely trying to crack down and lead itself and know what's best for its own greater government control and everything. During the COVID-19 crisis, there's enough dissatisfaction within the Chinese people, some dissatisfaction by Chinese entrepreneurial elite that economic growth was completely stifled, that the CCP's response with their total crackdown was heavy-handed and not appropriate. So at that moment, there were some questions over, okay, will Xi Jinping, with the new set of Chinese leaders, will Xi Jinping actually have to succeed some authority to Li Keqiang's camp? Unfortunately, that did not happen. Instead, the opposite happened. Xi Jinping cut out Li Keqiang and everyone as part of his kind of internal camp. Part of that was Hu Jintao, who, if you were following the news agencies, was very embarrassingly and mysteriously actually escorted out of the meeting in the leadership exchange conference there. And so because of that, the most important elements first is the elites. And in this case, if you want to see policy change, elites need to be fractured or disagree. If they're all on the same page, then usually history shows us they can control the mechanisms of the state well enough if they're willing to face the costs of doing so, but they can still maintain their directions there. So the elites were most important, but there are some questions of this fragmentation. We like to talk about how there's the Great Firewall of China, but there's ways to get around it. People are astute in terms of identifying to what extent things are outright propaganda, to what extent they aren't. So in this case, my kind of cop-out answer to this complex question is that as long as leaders are able to play to what the audience wants, doesn't mean it's what the audience needs, but if it's able to play to what the audience wants, then they can circumvent a lot of this counter information because individuals like to rationalize things. They like to think themselves as good and blame others for their failings there. So in this case, as long as the Chinese Communist Party emphasizes that Chinese people, all of the ills are coming from the US, cutting them off from technologies, that the US is the threat, that the West is the threat, that the West is trying to hold them down and preventing them from achieving the China dream, then to some extent that's going to resonate with the Chinese people and prevent them from fully disconnecting themselves from reality, despite some of the counter narratives and kind of counter information that exists there. So hopefully, Marco, you'll find that satisfactory enough. If not, you can berate me offline and I can try again.
All right. So one final question to wrap things up, and hopefully this will be a more fun question for you. Obviously, there was a lot of data that you gathered and reviewed in conjunction with writing this book. I'm interested to know, is there anything you learned during that research that surprised you? Something that was not part of your preconceived perceptions going into this research project?
Yeah, I think there were two or three things here. The first two are kind of similar. It was just how clear cut the Russian narrative was, and then how clear cut and different the Chinese narrative was. So going into it, I knew that Russia was a little bit more truculent and had its sense of pride and everything, but I didn't know the extent to which those narratives were projecting a realist great power mentality where Russia is going to create this Eurasian economic zone. Once I was done writing the book, I saw that. And so then when Ukraine happened, I was like, wow, that makes perfect sense, even though I was still amazed that we would have some type of large scale war like we were seeing with Russia's invasion in Ukraine. So that just surprised me at how well that fit into the Ukraine thing, but also how clear cut and one directional that was. And then the second thing was how much the Chinese narrative was different from that in terms of supporting and doubling down and trying to repeatedly communicate to the Chinese people the extent to which that China supported the international system. I found that surprising because it felt as if then you're promising a lot. You are putting all of your chips into free trade, and by doing that, I thought that kind of was less strategic because it tied to some extent China's hands. And generally speaking, the CCP likes to maintain some flexibility there. So that was kind of interesting, the extent to which they were supporting that element there. And then the third thing that I found actually came from some of the case studies when we looked at Venezuela and Iran. Venezuela was our example of complete failed ontological insecurity. So again, if you have a sense of history, 20 years ago, during the second Bush administration, Hugo Chavez was the big anti-US person, and Venezuela was actually garnering a lot of support and influence in Latin America. However, what you start to see is all of its stories about democratic socialism, the idea of US imperialism and everything from the past. All of that really started to crumble when the economy crumbled and when the domestic stability was completely gone. So in this sense, they were so ontologically insecure because of the actual environment that they couldn't believe in any of the stories. They lost all the power for the stories. And then what you then see is today they have little to no influence in the world stage, to such an extent that their own news media define themselves as merely pawns by Russia, to some extent China, and the United States. So that sense of negative agency and how that can then make people kind of throw up their hands and say like, there's nothing we can do around the world. That was kind of interesting as well as part of that project there. But overall, I think that the most enjoyable thing was reading all these news articles, seeing the world from the lens of these 4 different countries, and then going back and finding the historical narratives and cultural narratives that they all kind of tied to in support of that. So overall, it was great.
Well, this was a great presentation, very informative, in helping to explain for us state action, why states act the way they do. And for me, this puts a different lens on how I'm going to view those states in the future. Our World Affairs Club actually has a book club. Some of us meet monthly to discuss books. I suspect that your book is going to find its way on that list at some point. So there may be some follow-up in a year or so by some of our members, maybe commenting on your book or providing you with some thoughts. But we really appreciate you spending time with us today. This has been very, very informative. And I'll just end by thanking you and reminding our members to remember to join us on Thursday, March the 9th for our next presentation on International Women's Day. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Yep. Thank you all for the invite and for your time as well. And hopefully you all enjoyed it. Interesting times we live in, and I appreciate all those continued thoughts and all the work that you all do to help educate everyone about these important foreign policy issues.